This morning, we're going to be continuing the journey through 1 Corinthians. We've talked in the past about how it is that this letter was written to the Corinthian church 2,000-ish years ago, but yet it's still so very relevant for us today. And that even though this is a letter written to the Corinthian church, we get this privilege, this opportunity to look over the shoulder of the Corinthian believers and to read right along with them what it is that Paul is addressing to that church. But man, the more we look at this, the more relevant we see how it actually wouldn't be any different if it was written to us. That it's almost like we're sitting there 2,000 years ago with the Corinthian church looking at Paul's letter and saying, you know, this isn't only a thing for them, it's a thing for us. So I wanted to read this morning as we continue this journey into the book of Corinthians. And I wanted to pick up in chapter 2, verse 6 is where I'll begin reading. Where Paul says, "Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not wisdom of this age, or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him, these things God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person, which is in him? So also, no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. The natural man, or the natural person, does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things, but is himself not to be judged. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. But I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you are not ready. For you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? I can remember growing up wanting to do so for these two reasons. I wanted to grow up. So number one, I didn't have to listen to anyone. I didn't have to listen to the adults in my life. I didn't have to listen to my siblings. I could just do whatever it is that I wanted. I didn't have to listen to anyone. That's one reason why I wanted to grow up. And the second reason was so I can make my own decisions. And what I quickly learned is those are horrible reasons why someone would want to grow up. Because number one, decisions always impact a person's life, and we always have people that we have to listen to. You know, there's a difference between growing up and being mature. You know, we all find ourselves in that boat of wanting to grow up so we can boss someone else around or so we can boss something around. But do we ever say, I want to grow up so I can be mature? You rarely hear that. There's a big difference between the two, of growing up and being mature. Growing up has to do with gaining knowledge, has to do with gaining experience, has to do with gaining position, whereas maturity takes those three things, experience, knowledge, and position, and turns them into wisdom. Wisdom doesn't necessarily mean that you have wisdom just because you have a certain number of years behind you in life. You have more gray hairs on your head. That doesn't necessarily mean you have wisdom. I'm not saying that if you have gray hairs, you don't have wisdom. I'm just saying that having gray hairs doesn't necessarily mean that you have a lot of wisdom behind you. Or you have a lot of letters behind your name. Just because you have a lot of degrees, it doesn't mean that you have a lot of wisdom. Just because you have your name on the dean's list every trimester or every semester, that doesn't mean that you have a lot of wisdom. You have a title at your place of employment. You say a lot of quippy sayings. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have a lot of wisdom. The true test of wisdom comes into play, not in one of these things that I listed above, but in who we listen to. Wisdom comes into play when we have our ear tuned to the right person. This is where we find the Corinthians. The Corinthians were struggling with who it is that they were going to listen to. Were they going to listen to the wisdom of man? Or were they going to listen to the wisdom of God? And I hope that the text that we're looking at today in 1 Corinthians we'll see the following. We'll see what it is that human wisdom leads to. But I also hope that we can see that God's wisdom impresses something on our life. Our human wisdom that we have often reveals what it is that we want to hear. Our human wisdom reveals what it is that we want to hear. And this is to be expected. Who doesn't like to have their thoughts listened to? Who doesn't like their own thoughts? When we hear words that come out of our mouth, or when we see our words written on paper, it's almost like, hey, look, Mom, look at this. These are some great thoughts. Everyone should hear them. The human mind is a very, very interesting thing. There's been a lot of research and study that's happened over the last couple of decades on the human mind, about how the human mind can be hurt, about the stresses that affect the human mind, the damage that's done to the human mind because of abuse and various things that happen in a person's life, various experiences that happen in a person's life, but also the healing that takes place in life, in the brain. It's a very fascinating thing. And recently, I was just reading an article this past week that recently there was a group of people that did a study on the brain. And what they were doing is they were trying to figure out how many thoughts we have. Now, the way that they did this, I don't know all of the science behind it, but from what I read, what they did was they used brain scans and they used the blood flow in the brain to determine the number of thoughts that we have. There's something about the brain flow started and stopped, and that kind of initiated a thought. And so in their research that they did, they determined that humans have about 6,200 thoughts in one day. You and I have about 6,200 thoughts per day. Now, all of those thoughts are normal. It's normal human behavior to have thoughts. It's what it is that we do with these thoughts. What do people do with these thoughts? What do you do with these thoughts? Well, some of these thoughts that we have in a day, they come into our mind and we don't really have the time to process them. We don't have the time to develop them, and so they just kind of come into our mind and they leave. But there's other thoughts that we take and we kind of manicure. We kind of take those thoughts and we kind of look at them and we develop them a little bit further. They develop a life of their own. They have a story that's put around them. And what we do in order to do this, we think about them, we keep them in our mind, we jot things down, we do research, we read, we have conversations with people. And when we do this, we see these common threads that are all wrapped around this thought. And so we come up with a conclusion about these thoughts. And then what happens when we have a foreign thought that comes into our mind, or a new thought that comes into our mind, we either look at it in the context of our conclusion that we've come up with, and we do one of two things. It's hostile towards our conclusion, so we throw it out. Or we see that it can help our conclusion along, and we assimilate it into our conclusion. And it kind of changes our conclusion, but it helps it out. It solidifies our conclusion. But what happens is that as we begin to develop these thoughts, we realize that there's a potential for us leaving someone out of those thoughts. That someone is the wisdom of God. That someone is God, that someone is God being left out of our thoughts. And so we hold on to these thoughts, these conclusions, this human wisdom that we've come up with, which I'm not saying that thoughts are bad. What I'm saying is that we hold on to these human thoughts of the here and now and what we see happening right here. And we have God's wisdom that comes in and kind of challenges what it is that we've thought about, these conclusions that we've come to. And we kind of shake our finger at God and say, God, don't you mess things up in my life. Don't you mess with these conclusions that I've come up with. And when we do that, when we only look at the here and now and the human thoughts and the human wisdom that we have, and we exclude God's wisdom, it blinds us to God's plan. And this human wisdom that we hold on to that excludes God's wisdom leads to destruction. And some of you might say, yes, my life is a mess right now. My relationships are a mess right now. My personal life is a mess right now. My work life is a mess right now. And you will fully admit, my life is a total mess because I have disregarded God's wisdom. Others of us might say, I don't see a lot of destruction in my life. My life is perfectly fine. But what we don't see, if we're a follower of Christ, what we don't see is that when we don't follow God's wisdom and only our wisdom, that the other people in our life that are looking at us and saying, you know what? They say they follow Jesus, but the way that they live their life isn't a whole lot different than the way that I live my life. And I know that my life is not that great. And so their life, man, Jesus has made no impact. God's wisdom has made no impact on their life at all. And this quiet destruction begins to take hold. We don't see the quietness of hurt that is caused in relationships because we've excluded God's wisdom from our life. The hurt in relationships that just festers under the surface. Or we don't see the arrogance that we have because we've excluded God's wisdom from our life and we've held on to our wisdom and hold our word to such a high degree that we kind of get a little arrogant with our own thoughts. Either types of these destructions, either, this very visible destruction or this very quiet destruction in our life that's limited to the here and now, the right now in this moment, that God's wisdom has been neglected. This destruction happens. We find ourselves standing right next to the Corinthians because they're struggling with that same thing. The power of God, the wisdom of God. We talked about last week about how it is that they were struggling with the power of God versus the power of man, and the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of man. And they were following after their own wisdom. They were following after their own power. And we remember back, I just remind you of what Paul said right before the text that we're looking at today. About how Paul came to them. He says, "My speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power." Verse 5 of chapter 2 says, "So that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God." Paul is encouraging them to not hold on to their wisdom of men, but to rest in the power of God. And Paul continues their argument here in verse 6 of chapter 2, where Paul is making a point, and he's using irony to make his point. Irony would be that Paul is making an argument for one thing, but his audience thinks that he's making an argument for another thing. And he's using a lot of the same language as what they would be used to, and they're kind of following along with him, but then at the very end he kind of turns it on its head and say, "Look, you guys really aren't who you think you are." And that's what he's saying here as he begins in verse 6 of chapter 2. Paul's point is, he's saying, you think you're mature. This word for mature is the same word that is used to describe those who have arrived at an advanced stage of spiritual insight and perfection. And Paul is saying, you think you're there. You want to talk about maturity? Okay, let's talk. Because you think you belong in this category. But let's take a look for a moment to see where it is that human wisdom leads us. He points out in verse 8 of chapter 2 that human wisdom is restricted to the here and now, and it leads to destructive behavior. He says, none of the rulers of this age understood this. What he's talking about here, just to give a context, he's kind of going back to Christ. He's going back to Jesus and the leaders that were revolving, that were in Jesus' world at that moment. And he says, none of the rulers of this age understood this. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Paul was saying that your wisdom is restricted to the here and now, but yet when you restrict your wisdom to only the here and now, it leads to a destructive pattern of a person's life that rests on rhetoric and philosophy, and it leads to nothing but destruction. If you want an example of it, look at the last 2 weeks in our country of where rhetoric and philosophy have led to. It's culminated into those images that we've seen on the news about people storming the Capitol because of human rhetoric, about human philosophy. And it's led people to raise fists one against another. I'm thankful, at least I haven't heard that they've used Scripture to justify the acts that they've done. It's all been human rhetoric and human philosophy that's led to this destructive acts that we've seen. Because human wisdom feeds into and it appeals to the destructive patterns of man. Where human wisdom reveals what we want to hear. But yet what we see about God's wisdom is that God's wisdom reveals what we need to hear. Paul goes on to talk with them, and he shares with them, all right, you say you want higher wisdom. If you really want higher wisdom, if you want a wisdom that's going to change how you view things, and it's going to change people that you interact with, if you really want wisdom that's going to make an impact, that's going to make a splash in your town, here's what you need to do. Number one, you need to know the depth of God. In verse 10, he says, these things. Well, what are these things? Go back up to verse 9. What no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined. What he's saying is that these things, no man can come up with them. These things, no man has ever seen or heard. The heart of man can't imagine them. What God has prepared for those who love him. These things that come from the wisdom that far exceeds man's wisdom, God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. If you want true wisdom, if you want wisdom that's going to make an impact in your life, know the depths of God. Paul goes on to talk about how this wisdom, or about how the spirit of a person reveals what's inside of a man. You don't know what's going on inside of my life until I actually say something. Just like I don't know what's going on in your life until you actually say something. And that's what Paul is saying, is that the Spirit of God has revealed the spirit of man, what goes on in God, the Spirit of God has revealed what goes on inside of God's mind. And he's revealed it to us. It's not philosophy or popularity. It's not rhetoric. It's not vigilante revolution. But it's love and mercy and justice that are all wrapped up in Jesus' life. Because if you look at Jesus' life, he came to this world because he loved us. Because he knew that justice was needed. That there needed to be justice for man's rebellion against God. This justice included us being excluded from God's presence. But what Jesus did is he came, and he came as a sacrifice so that we can experience the mercy, so we would not get what we deserve. And this is the depth of God. This love and this mercy and this justice that is wrapped up in Jesus' life and that is offered to us. It's offered to us freely. Paul is saying you need to receive it freely in verse 12. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. This salvation, this love, this mercy, this justice that's wrapped up in Jesus' life. But here's the problem. The problem is man wants to do what man wants to do. Man, people resist this freedom, this free gift that's been given. And we try to do things our own way. We see this in James, because James talks about wisdom as well. Later on in the New Testament, he talks about this wisdom from above. And he says that this wisdom from above, he says, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Sounds familiar, right? The Corinthians are fighting amongst themselves. Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? That you want what you want and you're expressing that through your thoughts? You desire and you do not have, so you murder. You covet, you cannot obtain. So you fight and quarrel, you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your own passions. James is pointing out a very similar thing that Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to realize. That you don't have God's wisdom because you're not asking for it, because your own passions within your own self are more important. Your own human wisdom is more important than turning around and asking for God's wisdom. And you don't have God's wisdom because you haven't taken the time to stop and ask for God's wisdom. Paul is saying to know the depth of God and to receive it freely. So it is that we can see the world differently. In verse 16 of chapter 2, back in 1 Corinthians, Paul concludes his argument. He's saying at the very beginning, you guys think that you have it all together. You think you've arrived spiritually. But what he's making an argument for is that you have not, because you haven't asked for it. You've been living based upon your own human wisdom. But what he's making in this very last bit of his argument is that it's not to be that way, because we have this mind of Christ. And one of the 6,200 thoughts that came to my mind this past week was, well, what does Paul mean when he says that you have the mind of Christ? Because the Corinthians have not been living out the mind of Christ. Well, if we want to see the mind of Christ, we can go to John chapter 15, when Jesus is talking with his disciples. And he says in John 15, verse 12, this is Jesus talking with his disciples. He says, "This is my commandment, that you what? That you love one another. As I have loved you, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do as I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you." This wisdom that the Father has, I have made that wisdom known for you to grab a hold of. "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, that you should go and bear fruit, that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you love one another." What is this mind of Christ that Paul is talking about? It's this laying down our life for others. It's taking our own human wisdom and turning to God and saying, "God, I need your wisdom." And that wisdom that's revealed to us will then in turn cause us to lay down our life for our friends. Lay down our life for others and for other people. Is it just so people can walk all over us? Is that why we lay our lives down for them? It's so that our lives should bear fruit. Jesus is saying that you should have the same fruit in your life that I have shown in my ministry and that I've shown in my life. That fruit that comes out of Jesus having a focus of a focus of seeking and saving the lost. A focus that Jesus communicates with his disciples when he leaves to go back to the Father, where he says, "I want you to go and make disciples." That's one and the same. This seeking and saving the lost and making disciples is the same thing. And that's what Jesus is saying. That's what Paul is saying about Jesus. That he's laying down his life for his friends. That we should do the same thing. So that we can see fruit. Be just as Jesus saw fruit in his life. Of seeing the disciples taking a step closer to Jesus. And that's the fruit that we should see in our life. God's wisdom reveals what we need to hear. Because laying down our life for a friend is totally foreign to us. That is so far from human wisdom. So they can experience the love and justice and mercy through Jesus. But as we see in Paul's argument, in Paul's communication with the Corinthians, that they haven't embraced this. They haven't pursued God's wisdom. They only hear what they want to hear in their human wisdom, and they don't want to hear what God is communicating to them through his wisdom, the things that they need to hear. And we see a sad state of them rejecting God's wisdom. Paul is saying, you think you have fruit in your life. You think that you're mature. You think that you're spiritually arrived. That you are there. But he says you don't. You don't have the fruit that's seen in Jesus' ministry. You aren't pursuing God's wisdom. You thought you were mature, but Paul actually talks to them and says that in verse 1, he says, you think you're there, but you're actually infants. You're babies. You're throwing your temper tantrum in the corner because you're not getting what it is that you want. Because you're not listening what you need to hear in God's wisdom. This maturity that you thought you had just ain't happening. It ain't happening in your life. Why? Because you're more concerned about winning the opinion argument. Kind of interesting, he goes back to this argument that he started out in chapter 1. Here we read in verse 2, the very end of verse 2. And even now you are not yet ready. You thought you were there, you thought you had arrived, but you're not even close to being ready. For you are still of the flesh, for while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? You're only behaving based upon your own human wisdom? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not merely being human? Fascinating. Paul, 2 chapters later, wraps up this argument about how it is that they're expressing this opinion and how this is causing a division that's happening within the church. What about you? What about you? Because we find ourselves standing right next to the Corinthians. We would be fools to say that we have never acted like this. We would be right along with the Corinthians saying, well, you know what? I am mature. We have to look at our lives and say, man, Paul, I'm looking over the shoulder at the Corinthians, and this letter is really written to them, but man, I need this as well. Because this is where I find me, cheering on myself, looking for what it is that I want to hear in human wisdom, that I've come to a conclusion with all of these different thoughts that I've had, and all of these different conversations and readings that I've come up with, and I've come up with this conclusion. And God's wisdom is trying to break in from this outside, and he's saying, you know what? What about this? But God, don't mess with me. Don't mess with my stuff. This is my life. And we could do this as a non-follower of Jesus, and we could do this as a follower of Jesus, where we say, I really don't want you messing with me, God. Where are you? Where do we need to shed the human wisdom that we have and grow up into God's wisdom? Have you been caught up in today's rhetoric? Do you find yourself cheering for a vigilante revolution, a very human revolution? Or do you find yourself cheering more for a gospel revolution? Do you find yourself cheering for a side here on this earth? Or do you find yourself cheering for God's side? This gospel revolution that needs to take place in our neighborhoods, that needs to take place in our families, that needs to take place in our life, and see how the gospel changes us day in and day out. The symbol of our movement is the cross. It's not a donkey. It's not an elephant. It's not anything else. The symbol of our movement is one thing, and it's the cross. And you know what? That cross is foolishness to anyone that looks on it. But that's what we hold on to. That is God's wisdom. Man looks at that and say, that is stupid. But that's what we hold on to. It's not the posturing of man that we hold on to, but it's the power of God that's found in the cross that we hold on to. You might say, I don't care about politics. I don't even follow politics. I don't follow anything that's happening in the news. Okay. My question is do you have the mind of Christ? Take news and set it aside and just look at your life and say, do I have the mind of Christ? Are you pursuing the depth of God? Are you pursuing the love and the justice and the mercy that's found in Jesus? Are you growing in your understanding of this love and this justice and this mercy that's found in Jesus? So that you can go and share that with others. So you can share that love and justice and mercy in another person's life. Are you laying down your life for them? So that they can experience the same thing. So that the fruit in your life can be translated to be the fruit in their life. Just as Jesus came to seek and save the lost, and he came to make disciples, are you doing the same thing? Is it evident in the fruit of your life? Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning, and we find ourselves right next to the Corinthians, realizing that we lean heavily upon the things that we see here, the human wisdom that we see here. But may our lives rest in the power of God and the wisdom of God. May our lives rest in the cross and nothing else. Not in rhetoric, not in philosophy. May our lives rest in Jesus. What is foolishness to those who don't understand. That doesn't mean that we treat them any differently. That doesn't mean that we degrade them. Or that we have a loftier wisdom than them. It means that we share the love and the mercy and the forgiveness that's offered through the cross. May we see fruit. May we seek and save that which is lost. And help others take a step towards Jesus. We pray this in Christ's name.